All right, so in the last topic that we talked on in this, I guess we can call it a series at this point. We looked at why is baptism necessary? Why is it important? What can encourage us to be baptized? Um, One of the questions that was asked by a teenager in the Trenton youth group as part of my request for them to ask the questions that they have on their minds that they want answers for as relates to God, their lives, spirituality, that kind of thing. Um, but this week, we're going to look at this idea of how can I know God exists? A fair question, I suppose. You know, they're bombarded constantly by sources and influences that say there is no God. You are foolish for believing in God. Um, but we want to take a minute um, to talk about why that's not necessarily the case. Why it is not foolish to believe in God, and how it is actually scientific to believe in God, um, as well as uh, simply I guess knowing that because of the things that we do, just innately, are evidence as well. And we'll kind of get into that as well. But uh, with me again to talk about this is Blake Hayes from the Red Bank Church of Christ. Blake, how are you today, sir?
I'm pretty good. I've got some food on my stomach, so I'm feeling a lot better.
Well, hopefully we can get through this before it gets to the point of the meal where you're getting into the drowsy coma part.
Maybe so.
Um, anyways, like I said, we're going to look at it from a scientific standpoint because a lot of times the world will say that God and science they don't go together. Science is the way. Science will always disprove God, right? Um, but our goal today is in part to say that no, God and science are not mutually exclusive, and to help us with this, to help me with this, especially, I've turned to a great source um, of material for this very subject, Apologetics Press. They have some great stuff. If you ever have any questions about this, or if you ever have um, any concerns or stressors that, hey, I don't know if God is real, Apologetics Press. Apologetics Press is a great source, um, and specifically, I'm going to refer to a lot of stuff that Kyle Butt, uh, one of their representatives, use, and Blake, you're turning to who'd you say?
um, I've read a bunch of different
Yeah,
sources, but so I'll throw out a lot. Ravi Zacharias is
yeah,
really good. Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis is
yeah,
a really good one to read. We'll use that a little bit later on. For science, anything by John Lennox is really good. He's he's kind of spent his whole uh, or not his whole career, but a lot of his career in showing how science and God actually fit
yeah,
perfectly together. So he's a great resource for all that. He's also can be a little. He has 3 doctorate degrees and teaches at Oxford, so he can be up there a little bit as far as the intellectual side goes. But
yeah.
he has a really good way of bringing it down to simpleton's level like me. So
Like me, yeah,
um, yeah, those are
yeah.
some good.
So, and that's something that we're going to attempt to do is as we kind of go through this subject. Uh, we're also breaking it down for our own understanding, and so hopefully anybody that listens to this, watches this, will grasp it as well. But those are some great um, sources um, of responses for this question of does God exist. Um, but first things first, that when we talk about science and God going hand in hand, we've got to answer the question of is God testable scientifically, right? If we're going to say that science proves God, then we're also saying that we can uh, we can use science to break down factors that lead up to the conclusion of God. And if we can't say that God is testable scientifically, um, then the idea is that they don't go together. They don't go hand in hand. Um, so if we're making the claim that God exists and we can scientifically prove it, then we are also saying that we can use the scientific method and we can use science in general to prove that idea, right? Otherwise, we're just lying to make ourselves feel good. And so when we talk about the scientific method and we talk about that kind of thing, we oftentimes think of physically testing stuff, right? The only problem with that is God is a non-physical entity, right? God is spirit. God is not sitting in this chair. I can see him. I can use the other four senses: touch, hear, taste, smell, to realize that he's right there. So we can't use those five senses or anything like that to provide direct evidence for his existence, right? He can't actually be measured in a beaker, can't be experimented on in that kind of way. He can't be weighed on a scale. And so because of this, a lot of naysayers will say, well, therefore, believing in the creation story, right? The creationist belief of the universe, that's not scientific, right? Because if you got a supernatural creator, then he can't be tested, and if he can't be tested, then he can't exist. He can't be real, right? The former director for the National Center for Science, her name was Eugenie Scott. She's an avid proponent of evolution, which is a lot of what we hear today. Outspoken opponent of creationism. She once said, "The ultimate statement of creationism, that the present universe came about as a result of the actions of a divine creator, is thus outside the abilities of science to test." And so that's what we're up against, right? We're up against people that say, I can't see God, I can't hear God, can't be real. Therefore, he doesn't exist. The problem with that argument is that even in other areas of science, direct observation, using our senses, isn't the only way that we collect knowledge, right? For example, this same woman, Miss Scott, Dr. Scott, I'm not sure what her title is, Eugenie Scott, has also admitted that sometimes things happen, and we know they happen, although we don't directly observe them, right? So she said, explanations can be tested even if the phenomena being studied are too far away, too small, or too far back in time to be observed directly. For example, giant planets recently have been discovered orbiting distant stars that we cannot directly observe. So she's saying that we know this is happening. We know these giant planets, right? They're orbiting a star, but they're far too far away for us to be able to see. She says things that can be too far back in time cannot be observed directly, right? But we know that they happen because of other things that we can observe, right? So going forward, and I'll let you get in a word if you'd like at this point. But going forward, we're going to look at a couple of the laws of science as means of being the things that we can directly observe that point to God. That was a mouthful, I know, but let you get a word in.
What Miss Scott kind of holds to is this idea of verificationism, and it was a philosophy and idea that was really dominant in the 1930s and 1940s. But it's a fancy word for just a belief that says that any statement can only be verified by the five senses, right? Kind of like you said. And if it can't be verified by the five senses, then it's meaningless. It has no meaning, and it doesn't make any factual assertions. It doesn't present any facts. But and I don't know how recent her work has been, but this view of the world and even of science is not largely kept now. The idea of the only things that hold meaning, and not like like a feel like a sense for meaning in my life, but just an assertion of like I'm going to get some groceries today at 3 o'clock. That's that can be verified by you watching me go to the grocery store at 3 o'clock. It has meaning. But this idea that anything that can't be verified by the five senses has no meaning breaks down pretty fast, because much of what we talk about and do would be considered meaningless. Any math class you go into, you could just walk, which may be nice because you could just walk in and be like, this is all meaningless because numbers, I can't see them, I can't touch them, I can't hear them. They're not verified by the five senses, right? So what's the point in math? So this idea of verificationism breaks down pretty fast when it's held up to scrutiny.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to know that, like, even as science is hailed as the end all be all for fact, right? It is also malleable, and it is also constantly changing, and it in of itself is constantly changing its own mind about things, right? So, to your point, like, perhaps there was a time when we'd say the only way we know something exists is if we see it or interact with it. Now that's not necessarily the case. Now that's not necessarily 100% true all the time, right? Because the science has changed and we've found more. So even as God is held to scrutiny, right, by the scientific community, science itself is constantly changing, right? It is not necessarily always going to be a concrete foundation. In 10 years, we may discover something that changes something about what we truly believe in now, as far as science goes, right? But that kind of segues into the things that don't change, right? The things that we know just are. Those what we call laws, right? Those laws of science. And the first one that I've got down here is probably one of the most easily observable ones, right? The law of cause and effect. So boiled down to bare bones, the law of cause and effect says anything, any effect has a predictable cause, has something that is greater than or equal to the effect, right? And so when we're talking about creationism versus whatever else, we have to look at what is referenced and what is cited all the time, even though it's even in question these days by some people, and that is the Big Bang, right? The Big Bang is in a lot of textbooks, right? Or at least it was in my day. Number one, they don't use textbooks anymore; they just use Chromebooks. But number two, even in the 10 years since I graduated high school, the science has changed, but I'm pretty sure people still hold on to this as fact. But according to this idea, right, the universe was at one time, many years ago, packed into a very, very dense ball of matter that was about as big as the point on a needle, right? You're reading something, the period at the end of the sentence, right? The entire universe was packed into this, and apparently this ball exploded about 13.7 billion years ago, and this explosion is said to have created the universe as we know it. number one, I just think it's kind of laughable that people will turn down this idea of a creator God, but then turn to this. This kind of ludicrous idea of a tiny itty bitty ball that the universe fit in and then exploded out of nowhere for no reason, right? No cause. But apparently the effect was the universe, right? So they're, just looking at it, this idea of the Big Bang Theory, it goes against the law of cause and effect, right? It's not an adequate cause for such a huge universe, which scientists have theorized there's about 70 sextillion stars, which is that's a 7 followed by 21 zeros, and 100 billion galaxies, which have 100 billion stars on average in them. That's not adequate, right? That's not an adequate cause for this effect that we can go outside at night and look up at the sky. It's not an adequate cause, therefore it violates that law of cause and effect, right? The only adequate cause for what we can see in the universe is a creator God, right? An eternal being that was great enough, powerful enough, vast enough in and of himself to create such a thing.
Yeah, and even at its base level, the Big Bang theory is not something that should be feared by Christians. It has been in a while, or for a really long time. But even the biggest proponents, the ones who kind of discovered this theory, when they first put it forward, were very skeptical because they feared that it gave too much power to Christians. They published this theory, and some of the atheist scientists didn't want this theory published because the whole idea is that the universe began at a singularity, and that keyword, a lot of people focus on singularity, which we know nothing about. We don't know anything about that singularity that originated in the supposed Big Bang, but the word began. The whole theory puts forth this idea that the universe began to exist, and then of course once you open that bag, you don't have too many options to go because, as Dallas Willard put it, he's another Christian writer. He says, however concrete physical reality is broken up. So take something physical, however you slice it, dice it, break it up, whatever, you end up with a state of affairs that does not explain its own existence, right? Kind of what you said about the law of cause and effect. Take anything in the physical universe, break it up however you want. Nothing can explain its own existence. If I have an apple that falls out of a tree, there has to be a cause for, like you said, that apple. And of course, we would go to the tree. Well, the tree produced the apple, and then the seed produced the tree. Okay, well, where did that seed come from? Well, you keep going back, and you have this endless regress of cause and effect, which is not possible, right? You can't have an infinite regress of cause and effect. You have to have a start somewhere. So this idea, just even if it were to come out tomorrow that the Big Bang theory was all correct, Christians should be like, well, I guess that's how God did it, right? Because something had to cause that at the beginning.
Yeah. Even if if that were to be the beginning, it had to have a beginning itself. So what's the explanation for the beginning of that? So it really doesn't hold up to scrutiny that well. So the law of cause and effect, it is evidence that points towards the existence of God, right? The second one I'm gonna look at. We're gonna try to get through this a little bit quicker than we did the last video. We could both go on and on about any given subject, I think, especially this one. But we're gonna try to get through this a little bit quicker. But the second one is the law of biogenesis. And simply put, the law of biogenesis says that every living cell, every living organism in the physical universe comes from a previously existing cell or organism of its kind. So, for example, dogs give birth to puppies, not elephants. Cats don't have cats have kittens, not giraffes. Humans give birth to humans, not monkeys or lizards. And so this law of biogenesis, everything gives birth to things after its own kind. It's used in all genetic studies, right? It is the foundation of it, and it's a experimentally verified basis for every biological fact in nature. So everything that we know about biology in nature, in life in general, it is because we know this is a fact, right? However, we have to deal with something else that is taught as fact, right? Another theory that is taught as fact, and that is the theory of evolution. This theory claims that the first living cell spontaneously generated from non-living chemicals. You cannot have life come from non-life, but that's what evolution teaches. That the first cell came out of non-living chemicals. And because of this law of biogenesis, we know that that cannot be the case. This theory violates the law of biogenesis. It goes on to say that living organisms can give birth or produce other living organisms that is not of its own kind. Again, going against this law of biogenesis. However, taking into consideration all the things that the law of biogenesis means, it fits perfectly with the creationist standpoint, right? If organisms in the physical universe must produce after their own kind, then some type of supernatural agent must have created the first organism of each kind. Kind of going back to what you were saying just a minute ago, of there's got to be a beginning to something, right? The answer to the apple tree was, at some point, an apple tree was created, which dropped an apple, which planted the seed, which grew the next apple tree, and so on and so forth, right? And so this law of biogenesis goes forth perfectly with the Bible narrative. The book of Genesis says this, Genesis 1, verse 11, 21, 24. It says, God instructs them to multiply after their kind. Going with what this scientific law states, right? So, once again, we've got this scientific law, something that is in concrete, we know to be true, one that is a foundation for that whole area of science that is perfectly fit with creationism, with this idea that a supernatural creator is the reason for everything.
Yeah, that's perfect. I think you nailed it.
And moving right along, unless you have something to contribute to that, is the next one is the law of design. So this will be the third law that we look at, and then we'll move into the next portion, and I'll really kind of hand the reins over to you at that point. Is the law of design. So, for example, or excuse me, for explanation rather, when design exists, there has to be a designer. You don't look at something and just assume it just existed like that always. An example that Kyle Butt likes to give whenever he speaks on this topic is, imagine that you're walking down a beach, right? And you see a laptop kind of lying in the sand. What's your first assumption about the laptop? Well, you assume that it was created by a manufacturer of computers, right? You don't think to yourself, well, the materials necessary for this laptop were joined together in the depths of the ocean, and creatures brought them together, and then lightning struck, which caused the electricity. We don't think that, right? It's not an accident that the laptop exists. It was designed by someone and it was created by someone. So think about that with a laptop and how complicated a laptop is, which I'm sure the technological crowd is thinking they're not that complicated. But for me, they're complicated. All right, let's just go ahead and get that out of the way. But for something like that to be the case, think how much more so, even more complicated systems um, and other things like that are. For example, the human body, right? The human eye, what it is capable of and what it is made up of. It it doesn't make sense that it just happened. The ears, how they work, the brain in and of itself, the organic supercomputer that is our brain. It just doesn't happen, right? There's design to it. So how can we say that there's no designer? Um, there's a field of science called biomimicry. And in this field, scientists will look at nature and mimic or copy the designs that they see into useful technologies. When we look at the airplanes that take us, there was someone that looked at a bird one day and said, there's something about this creature that allows it to fly. What if I did that as well? So they started working on that, right? And lo and behold, in January 2021, we've got planes all over the place, right? We've got helicopters all over the place. If you've got your Bibles, I'm going to reference a couple of scriptures here before we move on, that show this principle, right? That if there is design, there has to be a designer. So Psalm 19:1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmaments show His handiwork." You look around you and you think how beautiful, how complicated this whole world, this universe that we live in truly is. The law of design says that there has to be a designer for it. It is not an accident. You observe the world, and the conclusion that you can only reach if you're honest with yourself is that it's not an accident. It cannot be an accident, right? Look at Romans 1 verse 20. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Now, Paul's writing here, and he says, you look around you, and the attributes of God are clearly seen in nature, right? Just because you cannot see God, that doesn't mean that he is not there. He is not present. His fingerprint is not in the world. Look around you and you see His signature, right? I don't have time to get into it because we're going to move on and finish up here in the next couple minutes. But and perhaps you know a little bit about it, Blake. I don't know if Fried Hardeman would have taught you this or not. But if y'all have time and you're interested in it, look into the golden ratio, right? The Fibonacci sequence. That's one of those things that that is a sequence that replicates itself throughout all of nature in so many forms, in so many ways. And another one of those ways of saying, like, I see design, there's got to be a designer. So, all this to say, looking at these laws of science, God and science are not mutually exclusive. Laws of science prove His existence. And so to kind of step back away from that a minute, we'll kind of finish up here looking at us, right? At something that is ingrained into us.
Yeah. So, a guy I mentioned earlier, John Lennox, he wrote a book called "Can Science Explain Everything?" and he's had multiple debates about that with other scientific professors. But and I would agree with him. He holds that no, science can't explain everything, right? Science merely shows us what is, not why that is. He gives the example of a teapot. If I'm boiling water for tea and I set the water on the stove and it starts boiling, and my wife comes in and she says, "Why is there water boiling on the stove?" I can give her the scientific explanation of why the water is boiling, of particles breaking down, and all this different stuff, what makes water boil. Or I could say because I wanted to make some tea, right? And both are adequate explanations of why there is water on the stove. Um, so it's the same way in nature. There are more ways, different ways of explaining why certain things are or are not. Science can't explain everything. It really shows. And one thing that we see a lot in nature and our lives is that people argue and disagree. Um, you walk around. Just on my way home today, there was a dude behind me. He wasn't honking. I don't think he was honking at me, but just railing on the horn because this guy was in the turn lane, which is not really a turn lane, but everybody treats it like a turn lane. But he wasn't turning, so he was a little angry. So he was just laying on his horn because he believed that this guy was in the wrong. Um, whether he was or not is up to the traffic laws, right? But we have this standard which we think others ought to obey, a standard which people ought to live up to. And so one way that Christianity and God has been defended is through the existence of moral values in our lives. And I mentioned this earlier, but C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, even if you're able to just read the first book of Mere Christianity, it's separated into 4 books. If you're only able to read the first book, do it because it's really good, and the rest is great. But he walked through this idea um, of this idea of a law of human nature. So he notices that people will disagree on this earth, right? We have this standard, like I said, which we think people ought to obey. And then he says, but there also seems that kind of shows that there seems to be a law within man. But this is different than natural laws, like we've been talking about, right? Like you have the natural law of gravity, with which men and objects obey, right? If I take myself and a rock into a helicopter and I drop that rock out of the helicopter, it's going to follow the laws of gravity, right? If I jump out of that helicopter, I'm going to follow the laws of gravity and go down as well, and hopefully have a parachute. But there's also this law of human nature, which is a little different. It doesn't tell us what merely is, like science does, but it tells us what we ought to do. And this is evidenced by when we do break this code, which C.S. Lewis points out that we do almost every day. We feel guilty about it. Why would I feel guilty about something that doesn't exist, right? If 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 there's no thing that tells me this is how I ought to treat somebody, why do I feel bad when I do treat that person differently than I think they ought to be treated, right? So this law is not simply observed. If some alien life force came and shot videos of humans day by day interaction, they would not be able to tell that this law existed, right? They could say that the law of gravity existed, the law of whatever existed, but they wouldn't exactly be able to pick out. And how could they, right? Because the law doesn't, like we said, it doesn't state what is, but what ought. So it lies within ourselves. And so so with that, we want to know if this universe simply exists for no reason, right? Is there just no reason for this existence, or is there a power behind it? And mere facts aren't going to lead us to the answer in this case, but we can know from because I'm a human, because I experience. And when I look to myself, like Lewis says, I see that there are laws within me that when I break them, I get uncomfortable. So why is that the case? Um, and another good resource and guy to listen to read is Ravi Zacharias, and he he notices that there is evil. Right, there's one of the biggest objections to Christianity is there's evil and suffering in the world. If that's the case, then what is God doing about it? Why isn't He doing anything about it? There is no God, right? But he says if there is such a thing as evil, then He has to grant there's such a thing as good, right? There's no evil and there's no good. And if there's such a thing as evil and there's such a thing as good, then there must be a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil, right? How can I know what the difference is if there's not a law to compare it to? And if there's a moral law, then there must be a moral lawgiver, right? There must be somebody behind that law um, that gives that guidance in our lives. And so the opposite of evil existing in the world doesn't lead us to the conclusion that God doesn't exist, right? But should lead us to the conclusion that yeah, he does exist. Yeah, you can shoot off that if you need to. I'm need to close these blinds because it's getting dark again.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a good point because it's a question that is ignored a lot of times. I think um, the question of why do I feel bad when bad things happen? Why should I feel bad when things when things go wrong, when bad things happen? Um, because there's if there's nothing beyond now and this and where I'm at and whatnot, then there's no real reason for me to feel morally obligated one way or another about something. But the fact that we do feel those things, the reason or the fact that we do feel guilt about things, or we do feel like, you know what, that's an evil person, or you know what, that's a good person. The fact that we have those indicates that there's something more, right? There's something beyond us. Um, because again, and even this to an extent goes to back to the law of cause and effect, right? The effect being that we have morals, we have morality, we have that law that you were just talking about, that law that states this is good and this is bad. If that's the effect, then what is the cause? Do we just up and decide one day, you know what, gonna believe in good and bad? No, there's got to be a lawgiver, um, a moral lawgiver, right? In the same way that that he puts his thumbprint in the world and in these scientific laws, he puts his thumbprint in us by saying this is good, this is evil.
Yeah, and this is, of course, there are a bunch of different arguments for God's existence that we've covered. This is one of my favorites. Um, uh, there's a guy named Bertrand Russell. He was a very avid atheist, did not believe in God whatsoever. Um, and and when he was posed with this question of how do you differentiate between good and evil, right? He said, on the basis of feeling, like what else? I base it on feeling, how I feel. Um, but Ravi Zacharias kind of responds to this, and he points that there are different things. He uses the example of um, some villages say treat your neighbor with respect, and other villages consume and eat their neighbors. Which one do you prefer, right? And that's kind of his funny way of responding to that. But it can't just be feeling that we base this off of. He later goes on to retract that statement. Bertrand Russell did, and he said that he just simply he says that it can't be feeling, that can't be the basis on which we differentiate between good and evil, because look at we always point to the Holocaust, right? And because it is the example almost the epitome of evil that's existed in this world. And uh and what they were doing, they felt was right, right? They felt like they were doing the right thing, but of course no one now would look to that and say, yeah, they felt right, so it's okay. Now, of course not. So there has to be something more than just feeling. That's why Bertrand Russell ended up retracted that, and he ended up saying, I don't even know how we deal with this issue of morality. It's just I don't know what to do with it. And then now Richard Dawkins comes by, and he claims that we know what to do with it now. Um, and he says that we have to deny that the existence we have to deny the existence of evil. Um, just just flat out say no, there is no such thing as evil. And you can, and that statement should almost like pin you back to your seat, and say, really? Like, there are women and children in different countries who, um, for no fault of their own, for no reason, are take and grabbed by men and to do whatever they want to with them. Uh, Children of even as young as like 12, 18 months old. Um, so you can't look at that and say, yeah, that's not evil, right? Ravi Zacharias, when he was in a Q&A, had somebody contest him on this, and he says, no, I don't think there's no way to say that something's evil. Um, and so he pushed him a little further, and he kind of pushed him into a corner a little bit. Um, but the guy kind of held to his belief, and so Robbie says, okay, if I picked up a baby right now, newborn baby, grabbed it in my hands, and and killed him right in front of you, would you say that was evil? And the guy took him, he's a college student, and took a minute, and he looked at Ravi and said, I don't think I can tell you that that was evil. And then there was an audible, Ravi said, there was an audible gasp over the audience. And so you can see what this kind of thinking leads to. If we deny the existence of evil, then we have no right to say that anything's right and wrong. So there has to be some type of standard that we look to for this.
Yeah, and two, like it just kind of going back on that what you were saying earlier a minute, our own judgment and our own feelings on things are in general just not a good thing to make a huge decision on, like this. You know, we're told, you know, in Jeremiah, first of all, that the heart is misleading in all things. You know, and you've got people all the time, follow your heart, follow your heart. Um, but our heart misleads us, right? Um, and yet, and yet, um, we could still tell the difference between good and evil based on um, based on what we just innately know, right? Um, we just know that, you know, these examples that you give are wrong. We can't deny that. We can't just shut it off and say that's not evil. Evil doesn't exist. Good doesn't exist, right? It's not possible. The only reason and the only way that we could is so that we can be right and stick to our guns and stick to our arguments, right? Um, but even then, it doesn't make it so. Um, so just this fact that we have morality is in and of itself a strong um, argument and a strong piece of evidence to show that there is a God. Because if we have this moral code, this moral law, then there's got to be someone that has written the law, written the code.
Yeah, and of course, the biggest response you'll see with the idea of morality is, okay, evil does exist. Why? And Epicurus is famous for saying, if God is all loving and all powerful, okay, God's all loving and all powerful. If that's so, evil exists. So either God is um, not all loving, uh, and he doesn't care about the evil that exists in this world, or he's not all powerful. He can't do anything about the evil that exists in this world. So, and he kind of puts those two against each other. Uh, we could go on for hours about that, but there's the idea of yes, evil does exist in the world, and there are things that we see that just don't make sense, that are beyond our explanations, beyond anything that we can grasp. And when John Lennox, mentioned him a couple times, I love him, he's awesome. But he was posed with this question in a Q&A of why does God exist? And he kind of summed it down to this, and he said, the message of the Bible all leads up to the cross, right? That is the culminating event in Christian history is God coming down to earth, sending his son to die on a cross. And so you have to ask yourself, why is he there, right? There's a bunch of ways he could have dealt with that, a bunch of ways that he could have come to this earth and done a bunch of different things, but yet the culmination of it leads to a cross. Why? And he kind of says that that he believes that that's because God has not become distant from the problem of human suffering, but has himself become part of it. He has not distanced himself from the suffering and evil that we experience, but came to earth and became part of that for us. And so there's also a guy named Michael Faraday. He was an experimental scientist. And on his deathbed, he had a friend visit him, and he said, "Sir Michael, what speculations do you have now?" Because he's an experimental scientist, so he's making speculations all the time. He said, "Speculations, man, I have none. I have certainties. I thank God that I do not rest my dying head upon speculations. For I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed to him against that day." And of course, we have a beautiful song about that. But I love that idea of there's things that we don't understand, and maybe the person who poses this question is truly struggling with this of how can we really know God is real, and hopefully this conversation has helped and will help lead you to that spot where you can say, I'm not speculating anymore. I rest my head upon certainties because of who I believe in.
Yeah, agreed. And honestly, this particular topic may need a part two, and we can kind of get into the more theological kind of reasons why you should not only believe in a God, but you should believe in the God, right? And not only should you believe in the God, but you should believe in his son Jesus, right? And not only should you believe in Jesus, but you should believe in his followers who wrote the word of the word of God, the Bible. So we can talk about that once we get done here. And man, this is just one of those subjects that you can go on and on and on about. But so that's it. We're going to call it a night here. Blake, do you mind closing us out in a prayer before we skedaddle?
Should I unmute myself? Yeah, I can do that.
Yep.
All right, let's pray. Dear God, we come bowed before you, lifting up your name, God. Thankful for all that you've done for us, and we're thankful for all that you've done for your people throughout history, the creation that surrounds us, God, and may we do everything we can to honor you and what we do, and look to you throughout our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Blake.